So vegan typically means eating no animal foods whatsoever, whether it be an egg, a piece of meat, a piece of fish, or an oyster or whatever. That's a vegan. I think that the con is the impact of the influence of a whole range of different groups and people who are arguing for plant-based is best for everyone. That is the con element for me. And in fact, chicken liver alone would give you so much of that. Vitamin A, vitamin C, folate, vitamin B12, more than you need, right? So it's amazing when you talk about superfoods and powerful, nutritious foods. That list, actually, everybody should have that on their fridge and try and eat that way at least once a week. A meal that combines those things, right? Once a week would be a good idea. And there are two elements of the bioavailability which need to be discussed. One is that anything in artificial form anyway, no matter what the source, is going to be different in your body and it may not be absorbed because it's not interacting in a food matrix with all of the other things, right? And also the body recognizes it and goes, that's false. I'm not taking that in.
Hello everyone, this is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. And our guest today has a master's degree in business administration, and she's worked in the business sector for many years. She's also a graduate of creative writing master's program at Kingston University. She's a published author of both fiction and nonfiction books. And today we're discussing her most recent nonfiction work called The Great Plant-Based Con. Jayne Buxton, welcome to Low Carb and Fasting.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Jayne, I remember when I met you a few weeks ago at the Public Health Collaboration conference, I told you I'm going to invite you to the channel, but please give me a few more weeks to finish reading the book. And I'm very pleased that I finally managed to finish reading. I took extensive notes on the book as well. It took me weeks and weeks, if not months. So how long did it take you to actually write 522 pages, people?
Yeah, and that was the abbreviated version because my editor and I cut it down by at least 70 pages. But yeah, so it took probably 3 years plus, a little over 3 years from starting my very in-depth research to actually getting it finished. And a year of that was actually, the last year of that was going through it with a fine-tooth comb with lawyers and making sure that we were not opening ourselves up to any charges from the various corporations that I discussed, for instance, in the book, and various people whose work I might be critical of. We wanted to be very careful that I discussed that in a way that was constructive as opposed to opening us up to some terrible dispute. So that took some time, but it was during that terrible time of lockdowns and COVID. And so actually the first year was pretty much, I was in my office and wasn't everybody was stuck at home, right?
Well, I'd highly recommend the book to actually anyone, whether you choose to eat plant-based or you eat animal products only, or you're an omnivore like Jayne Buxton herself.
Mm-hmm.
She's a very happy omnivore. She combines plant foods with animal foods. I call myself a ketovore, so whatever that may mean for you, whatever you choose for your diet, this book will benefit you because it's non-judgmental. And I like that about the book. You're throwing out all the arguments and you're telling people, now you have all these arguments in front of you, you can make an informed decision. Mm-hmm. And I like that about the book. Before we discuss the book, Jayne, can we define, because you do that in the foreword of the book, the words vegan, vegetarian, plant-based, as implied in the title, also the word con.
Con, yes.
Okay. Those definitions.
Well, those are quite a lot of definitions. So I think most people would be aware, although they could be forgiven for not being aware because the terms have all been used very loosely in recent years, I think. So vegan typically means eating no animal foods whatsoever, whether it be an egg, a piece of meat, a piece of fish, or an oyster or whatever, that's a vegan. Vegetarian typically includes people who eat no meat, but may eat dairy, may eat fish if they're pescatarian, whatever. So there's that variation. And plant-based has, I could say to you, who knows what it means? Because actually everybody uses it differently. So, and that was proven in some of the surveys, which I featured in the introduction to my book, which was when people are asked whether they are plant-based or not, some people who eat no meat or animal foods at all will say they are plant-based, but also some people like me who eat a lot of vegetables alongside their meat and fish will also call themselves plant-based. So when you're looking at surveys, you have to be really careful about what those definitions are, and it's not easy for people to navigate that. I think a new term that's come up is plant-rich. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people, doctors included, who are leaning towards us needing to eat more plants, but not quite wanting to go to the vegan recommendations, will say plant-rich, meaning mostly plants with a tiny, tiny little bit of animal foods. So, that's a confusing landscape, isn't it, for people, and confusing for people who write about it as well. And the con element, which you asked me about, is really not, I don't mean that word in the sense of a con person, a con artist at the center of some great big scam. I don't even mean it as a lot of groups of people coordinating very tightly to convince us that, say, vegan diets, plant-based diets are best for us. I think that the con is the impact of the influence of a whole range of different groups and people who are arguing for plant-based is best for everyone. That is the con element for me. And because all those people are arguing along the same lines, it feels like such a tidal wave. It feels like an insurmountable, irrefutable tidal wave type of argument, doesn't it? And the con element is really not that some people can thrive on vegan diets, because they can. Some people can, and vegetarian diets. I'm not even saying that eating vegetables and lots of vegetables is a bad thing. And people can eat varying amounts of those and thrive very well. The con is in telling everyone that it's best for everyone and trying to roll this diet out as the sort of savior of human health and the savior of planetary health, because it is neither of those things.
In other podcasts, you describe this whole argument as a three-legged stool.
Yeah.
Let's go through that. So what are the three legs of this sort of whole scenario?
Well, the three that we typically see being used are animal welfare, human health, environmental health. And people have historically argued from one or another of those kind of angles for plant-based eating. Then some bright spark connected all three of them, and now everybody connects all three of them. The advocates of plant-based eating typically connect all three, and they say not only is plant-based eating good for the environment, but it's better for the animals and better for human health. So bingo, how could you possibly refuse such a strong argument? Because three-legged stools, as we know, are very strong. If you remove any one of those legs, if you start to question whether or not a plant-based diet is better for health, for instance, those who are arguing based on that three-legged stool set of arguments get very angry, because they like the neatness of the package, the thing that says from every angle, whatever way you look at it, this is best. And so what I tried to do in the book was to unpick the arguments on all of those angles, particularly environment and human health. And I did address animal welfare to a certain extent, because I wanted individuals to be able to see that it is not such a neat, strong stool. It's a pretty wobbly stool, actually.
I like that you've cited, actually, I think it's from the Vegetarian Meat by Lear Keith.
Yes.
And you've cited one of her quotes where she says that, it's so much easier to come up with a slogan of meat is murder, and everyone relates to it. However, if you come up with with another slogan, for example, monocrops are murder, it's suddenly less relatable. Which is equally actually correct.
It is.
But no one relates to that. So
that's right. And in fact, I have done that. I've tried that in certain situations. I think we all try out different arguments in different scenarios. And I've tried saying things like monocrops are murder, and people look at me dumbfounded. What do you mean? And of course they are murder from the point of view of murdering the soil, murdering the organisms in the soil. But they're also murder in the sense that animals get killed in the course of monocrop farming, as you know. But when you tell that to somebody for the first time, they are flabbergasted. They maybe don't believe you. They certainly take some time to come around to that point of view.
Another thing that you mentioned, which actually makes sense, what's actually solidified over the past maybe 30 to 40 years, solidified the plant-based diet argument for to save the planet, to save the human race, because it's the best diet for humans. What's actually hyped it up is the media itself.
Yeah.
Right? And you talk about that, I think, right in the beginning of the book.
Yeah, the media has played a big role. And in fact, I devoted an entire chapter to talking about the various ways that media misrepresents the whole landscape in this debate. And that misrepresentation ranges from the very small, kind of seemingly innocuous levels of misrepresentation to bold-faced, very nearly lies and negligence on their part. So, an example of the former would be, for instance, that, some studies, a study, for instance, that I talk about, showed that people who eat a variety of very nutrient-dense food, ranging from livers and kidneys and eggs through to greens, live longer. Now, setting aside whether that study was any good or not, setting aside whether they actually do live longer, and we can talk about that at a later stage, what the papers picked up on was eat your greens and live longer. And it's kind of a lazy reporting, which is, I'm just going to go with the zeitgeist. I'm going to pick the thing out which everybody really wants to hear, and which I am used to hearing as a journalist. I'm just going to say that. And so that's done every day, 10 times over in every newspaper, So that's really that low level, consistent misrepresentation that we get all the time.
So, let's look at least one of the angles. Let's start with the environmental angle, right? Yeah. So this whole argument of climate change, and the cows are to blame. So is it the cows that are producing, because the producing the most greenhouse gases? Are the cows actually the gorilla in the room? What's the gorilla in the room?
Well, the gorilla in the room, as Frank Mitloehner, who's a researcher in this field, likes to say, is definitely fossil fuels and fossil fuel use. And that accounts for over 80% of all emissions. So we must always focus on that. So anything that's using fossil fuels is going to be generating excessive emissions. And to the extent that farming, including livestock farming, is also buffeting up that fossil fuel system, to that extent, yes, it is contributing. And so the kind of farming which is very bad for climate change is farming that, for instance, uses fossil fuel-based nitrogen fertilizers, for instance. Plant farming does that. So does some animal farming to grow the grains that feed some animals. So to that extent, yes, of course, livestock farming is a contributor, but how much of a contributor? And is that being overblown? And of course, I'm arguing that it is being overblown for various reasons. And I go through all the different ways that the impact of livestock is exaggerated. One of them is this very simple fact that livestock's emissions, which are widely agreed to be around 14% of the total emissions in the world, although the FAO did come out with a lower number this year and said 11%. But that number is based on a real life cycle analysis for livestock. So you're taking everything into account, what the cow eats, how it's raised, how it's transported, how that food gets to the table, okay? Transport, by contrast, does not take any life cycle stuff into account. So it's basically just looking at the emissions from the tailpipe. We're not looking at construction of the cars, the roadway system, the construction of the roads, and then the reconstruction of the roads, and all of the rainforests that, for instance, and forests that is taken down when we drive a new road through any country. So it's a really unfair comparison. And what the FAO said was, if you did a fair comparison and you took the life cycle element out of the cows, you'd have cows being responsible for about 5% and transport 14%. So suddenly that whole thing is flipped, right? So that's just a really simple way that the picture is distorted. But one of the other ways is just this whole misunderstanding around methane. Methane is an incredibly complex thing. The methane issue is a complex issue. But all we ever hear is that cows generate methane through their burps, although a lot of people say back-end activity, it's really burps. And therefore, we have to stop it. What they're not accounting for in that methane argument is the fundamentally different nature of the methane that is coming from cows. It is part of what's known as the biogenic cycle, meaning that it comes out of the cows. It is broken down by something called hydroxy radicals in the air, and it comes back to Earth as in form of carbon, which is absorbed through photosynthesis into the ground, into the plants that the cows eat. And the active role that cows play in this is that they can increase the extent to which that carbon is sequestered by creating different conditions in the ground if they're raised correctly. So we never take into account that sequestration. We never take into account not just what's going up, but what's being sucked back, the sinks. People call it sinks. So unless you're looking at the whole cycle, and if you're just looking at what's coming out, you're really not getting a very rounded picture. So it's complicated. It's complicated. And I think, as you will have noticed, at the panel that I ran at the session where you and I met, all three of my panelists, or certainly a couple of them, do believe that there is potential to cool the earth and to leverage the power of cattle to do that by reducing herd size just a little bit, because you set in place a motion which creates that, for want of a more complex description, it makes that virtuous circle work better to cool the earth. And so I can buy that argument. I can buy that we should be raising our cattle in a much more regenerative fashion to maximize benefit. I can buy that we could have some reductions in herds, but the kind of reductions which are being proposed in Ireland, for instance, are so dramatic and so harmful and will be very counterproductive in the end, I think.
Yeah, you do. You discuss it towards the second half of the book, regenerative farming and regenerative agriculture as being the way forward.
Yes.
Forward.
Yeah.
And combining livestock with agriculture.
Yeah. In a sort of mixed farm situation. Mixed farm situation. Yeah. And, the argument is sometimes given, oh, well, you can't do that at scale. You can't do that on any grand level, and we'd never have enough to feed people. And I think individual farmers are proving that that is incorrect. They are proving that they can generate just as much food in that mixed farming system. It'll be different kinds of foods and different mix of foods, but they can generate just as much. And do good for the earth and good for the soil at the same time.
Perhaps it'll be seasonal foods as well.
Perhaps.
And
Yeah.
that's how it was.
And some foods not available in some areas of the country or areas of the world, but other foods are in abundance because we grow different things in different places. So, there are many, many benefits. And what I really deplore actually is when journalists or commentators rely too heavily on models, scientific mathematical models, which take one type of farming, they feed those numbers into the system, and they come up with all kinds of conclusions which really are damning for animal foods. What is never reflected in those models is the on-the-ground experience of the best kind of farming. What is happening in those farms? How much food are we producing? How much is the soil being replenished? How much carbon is being stored from the sky, from the atmosphere rather? So those models can be an untruth, a form of untruth. And I really think that we need to be starting to factor in the real life experience of farmers, working with farmers to help them farm in the best ways.
Well, you have a citation from Gabe Brown.
Gabe Brown.
Gabe Brown of Dirt to Soil, and where he recounts his family's journey from monocrop agriculture to regenerative agriculture. And I think I like the quote, his quote, and he says, if you don't mind me reading it.
Oh, please do. I love anything Gabe Brown says. Yeah.
We need to wake up and realize that there is no shortage of food in the world. There are political and social factors that prevent foods from reaching the hands of the people who need it. So you discuss food wastage as well. So there is enough food, but no one discusses the food wastage.
No, they're just beginning to start to tackle food waste as a concept, but still you hear all the time, oh, we need to change, we need to go plant-based because we can't feed the world. Yes, we can feed the world. We need to fix those supply chain issues. We need to fix those political issues, which are stopping food getting to people, all of those things. Sure, as anything, going plant-based is not going to help assuage food poverty and hunger in those environments in developing countries where they rely on things like goats, cattle for meat and milk, and where they rely almost entirely on them for meat, milk, and also for their livelihoods. So to blithely say that going plant-based is the way to feed the world is irresponsible, I think.
You also cite from Dr. Natasha McBride, here from the UK. She's from the UK as well, because she wrote the book, The Vegetarian Myth. Vegetarianism Explained.
That's right.
That's the one where she actually says what you're just saying, that there is nothing saving the planet in choosing a vegetarian lifestyle. Just the opposite, you become an activist for the destruction of the planet.
Quite powerful words. Yeah.
Very powerful.
Again, if you said that in a room full of ordinary people, they would probably go, what are you talking about? So inculcated have we become in these arguments. It's almost like they're unquestionable, and people are regarded as just a little bit crazy when they say things like that. So we have work to do. We have a lot of work to do.
We have a lot of work to do because the forces which are advocating for plant-based diets for humanity are powerful. Very powerful.
And in fact, I was reminded today, somebody sent me, a friend of mine who's a great chemist and a great thinker, sends me stuff all the time, which is wonderful. And it's one of the things I've most loved about writing the book is that I'm now in touch with all these people who send me this amazing information all the time, which is always evolving. And he sent me this article about a specialist in plant-based meat who works at Berkeley University, Berkeley, I think they call it. We call it Berkeley, they call it Berkeley. And he's a specialist in alt meats. And so he's been studying this for ages. And you could say he has a vested interest in promoting those alt meats. But what he's saying is these meats are not viable They are not going to be able to replace animal sourced meats. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, to do with scalability, to do with the energy use, to do with the actual lack of viability of the very technology which is they're trying to implement. So he's saying, but the arguments are so powerful, and those individuals are going to hang on to those arguments in favor of plant-based and plant-based substitutes for meat because so much money has been invested. They cannot afford to backpedal and come off the track and say, actually, this isn't going to work. Maybe we're going to have to eat animal source foods after all. Nobody can afford to say that. So they are going to defend those arguments until their dying day. And that is what's happening. And it may well be that their dying day comes. And then they do have to suck up reality.
Yeah, you do have a whole chapter on fake meats. Actually, you call it faux meat, and I quite love faux meats and cell cultured meats. So that's another one. Something else I like about it. I like that you actually bring in references from current present day scientists, dietitians, researchers, nutritionists, doctors. Everyone knows. So your citations aren't just from the 1950s and 60s. These are people around us. These are people who have a very sort of active presence on social media that we can all relate to. So I love that you bring in even tweets and statements put out by be it Dave Feldman or Zoe Harcombe.
Yeah.
You have citations from Georgia Eid, James D. Nicolantonio, and all the rest.
Yes, yeah.
So everyone is cited in there. Everyone is referencing there. I like that because you bring in everyone's input. And then the picture kind of all comes together. It becomes so much clearer when you bring in different citations from different people. Now we've got to go next, I think, to the sort of the health side of plant-based diet. You give comparisons done by Zoe Harcombe. She's been talking about this for years, very long time. I've had her on this channel, by the way. I'll put the link for my audience so you can watch my interview of Zoe. So I think one of her criticisms was the 5 a day, right? So eat 5 fruits or vegetables a day and you'll be fine. Where does that 5 a day come from, by the way?
Well, according to her and other people too, it comes from a meeting in the 1980s, which involved the vegetable growers of California, and they were trying to find a way to, increase sales. And so it was a marketing slogan, basically, and it just took off like crazy. And of course, it really did take off, didn't it? Because is there a single person in the world, in the developed world, who doesn't know that phrase? And I think what's valuable about Zoe's analysis and about dissecting that phrase is nobody's saying that vegetables don't have some value. They do. And they clearly, even if you just look at them at the level of the nutrients that are delivered, they have some value. They also taste good sometimes to some people, and they're colorful, et cetera, et cetera. But it's this idea that a number, a specific number, can apply to everybody, and that's really going to be true, because there are people, and I know them and you probably know them, who absolutely thrive on a mostly animal-based diet with maybe 1 or 2 vegetables that they can tolerate because of blood sugar problems or because of gut irritation. They can't tolerate other ones, and they're doing great and they're really healthy. So the idea that the number 5 is a magic number is nonsensical. Of course, I understand why the government latches onto that, because they have to have simple messages delivered to people. But what I would really love the government's message to be instead is eat nutritious food and show people what nutritious food looks like. And then if it's more blueberries and fewer eggs for some people, or the reverse for others, it's the real whole food nutrition, which is key. And I'm pretty sure that if we really wanted to, we could come up with some simple slogans around that everybody would understand, right? And And actually, I don't want to segue too far away, but that leads me to the whole question of processed food. I think if we were to tell people simply make sure 80% of your diet is just fresh food that you recognize as simple ingredients and you've prepared yourself or eaten on its own in its unadulterated form, apples, avocados, lettuce, whatever. And that would be an unprocessed food, a real food diet. The contrast to that is a processed food diet. And I don't know if you saw the other night, there was this program on BBC One about processed food. And it was Panorama. Did their usual half an hour zip through the subject, right? Missing everything, missing a lot of important topics. And where they seemed to be going with that was highlighting particular ingredients in processed foods, such as emulsifiers, which are very bad for us. And they were chastising companies for using these and wanting them to use other things. And the point they missed entirely was, why are we eating that stuff in the first place? So why aren't they pointing to real whole food as the answer? And to a certain extent they did, but I think they missed a trick there. And most people do. I don't think we're going to get very far just by tweaking the ingredients of processed food. I think we'd have to take the processed foods largely out of our diet.
And the irony is that, even children know that 5-a-day thing. And when they see children's processed foods, right?
That's right.
Sugar-coated, strawberry-flavored candy, for example, right? Or some kind of sweet.
But it's one of your
five. It does have the 5-a-day on it. It does have the 5-a-day on it. Where's the science behind that?
Yeah.
Sugar. That's sugar and artificial sweeteners. There isn't a single strawberry in there.
No, that's exactly right. It's a fake strawberry, maybe.
Strawberry flavor, and that's all it is. But 5-a-day as a type 1 diabetic, you have one part, I think, one sentence about type 1 diabetes, and it made me so happy that you included that in there.
That was tough. Talking about type 1 and type 2 in the same book is hard. And in fact, I had a friend of mine who wrote to me and said, I wish you'd said more about type 1 because it's not initially caused by eating. Obviously, it's a totally different origin. That said, I think you would attest to the fact, because I've heard you say this on some of the podcasts you've been on, you would attest to the fact that diet can help manage it, right? Absolutely. So it doesn't cause it, but it can help manage it. And so maybe, I know very little about type 1, and you know obviously a lot. So I'm sure you have educated your listeners as to how to make the best of that situation with the way you eat, right?
I agree. Diet can help you manage it better. And I was very happy, by the way, that you mentioned it. Even though it was a very brief, I think a couple of liners, but it was good that you threw it in there. And coming back to the 5-a-day.
Yeah.
As a type 1 diabetic, my main objection to it, other than obviously the fact that processed foods seem also to count as your 5-a-day, in the perception of the public, at least, but also fruits and vegetables are all dumped in that 5-a-day sort of umbrella. Yeah. And they are completely different things. I mean, sugary, very sweet fruits are a no-go for me, yet.
Of course.
I don't know, salad leaves, lettuce and cucumbers are perfectly fine, but to dump them all in the same group, as long as you're having your 5-a-day, I could have 5 completely different combinations and have massively different impact on my blood sugars, for example. So it's just nonsensical, as you put it, but I love what Zoe Harcombe does to it. She says,
I know.
Look at it. If we look at this 5-a-day and we redesign it and we look at it from a purely nutrition angle, and we come up with 5 foods that give us complete
everything
nutrition, everything the human body ever requires. These are the 5 that you need. I think she says first, chicken liver. Second, eggs. And I think she also mentioned sardines. And she does actually mention plant foods as well, sunflower seeds and kale.
Kale.
This is those five foods. Combine them together, you're getting the full nutrients that the human body needs.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing. Beautiful. Yeah. And in fact, chicken liver alone would give you so much of that. Vitamin A, vitamin C, folate, vitamin B12, more than you need, right? So it's amazing when you talk about superfoods and powerful, nutritious foods. That list, actually, everybody should have that on their fridge and try and eat that way at least once a week. A meal that combines those things, right? Once a week would be a good idea.
Yeah, as designed by Zoe Harcombe.
Yeah. Oh, she's a hero, all right. She's a great hero of mine.
She understands nutrition. I mean, just as James D. Nicolantonio, it's on page 8.
Oh, he's fantastic. I mean, I have this book. Hang on. Have you got this one?
The Mineral Fix.
The Mineral Fix. Yes.
Mineral Fix.
That's bigger than my book.
I know.
I think it's 700 pages, right? And I consult that all the time because, of course, I can't keep all that in my mind. Right. And I sometimes forget about, which foods are really richest in which minerals, and I have to refresh my memory. But he's a great researcher. And again, he has said, you can't get the best complete nutrition from just animal foods. Just plant foods, I'm sorry. You need that combination to get the best out of everything because all of these minerals react together. And so if you're missing some, the others won't be as potent in your body and won't be as usable. So yes, all of these people that you mention, and you say that I include current day nutritionists and whatnot, my aim was specifically to do that, to make this a book that was kind of very approachable for people, where they might have heard of some of these people, and have them commenting on the basic science, because the basic science is really sometimes really hard to understand. And if people are only thrown papers, they may not either understand them or have a desire to understand them, or they may forget to go look them up because it takes so long to go and look up a paper and actually analyze it. So I felt that the book needed that mix of the high science and medium science, if you know what I mean, the science explained, which is what all these people do so well, is they explain it to us.
I love all your citations, actually, but when it comes to the Nicolantonio, you the calcium and iron and the differences in bioavailable iron, as in meat, iron which comes from plant foods, because obviously bioavailability is a big issue, and you do discuss that in the book. And I related to that personally because I was a vegetarian for 30 years.
Wow,
and if I thrived on it, if I thrived with intermittent veganism, but mostly vegetarian for 30 years, and if I thrived on it, I wouldn't want to eat animal foods, but I didn't thrive on it.
Okay.
You do say there are some people who do. I couldn't. After 30 years, it started almost catching up on me. So, so I had to start very reluctantly. Psychologically, it's a difficult thing to do. So I had to start reluctantly to include meat into my diet.
What was the single? What was the single biggest element of not thriving that drove you to make that decision, do you think?
Inexplicable fatigue.
Fatigue, right.
Suddenly, I just couldn't figure it out. We're going to like hearing this because it's also mentioned in your book. I tried every day. I tried playing with the fat intake. I tried increasing the protein. And at that time, as a vegetarian, I was purely relying on dairy and eggs, which are good. That eggs are superfoods indeed.
Yeah, they really are.
And even though, I would have a 9-egg omelette.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
It still wasn't enough for me. I probably wasn't reaching my protein leverage with 9 eggs. But we sometimes forget all the other, because we look at eggs and red meat purely as protein sources. We forget all the other minerals which are also contained in those protein foods. I tried everything. I tried increasing the fat, decreasing the fat. I'm obviously on a very low carbohydrate diet for my
Yes.
diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't much else I could do. So I started supplementing, which is what
Mm-hmm.
plant-based a nutritionist, for example, would recommend.
Say.
Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
put in B12, and I would buy really expensive and good quality products.
Mm-hmm.
So I started taking collagen powder, marine
Yeah.
collagen powder, B12, B complex vitamins,
Mm-hmm.
zinc, and you name it, I took it for months and months because I wouldn't want to eat meat.
No, you're trying everything else. Yeah.
Everything else, it wouldn't make much difference. And once I started eating meat, it took me literally 2 weeks. My whole brain changed. And I thought, now I suddenly feel I'm absorbing
Yeah.
nutrients from the food that I'm eating. So
Yeah.
it was magical. And if I explain it to someone, they won't believe me unless
Yeah.
they really want to. It's hard to believe. And if
Yeah.
someone told me, in fact, my mother would tell me for years,
Mm-hmm.
this isn't good for your health. I'd argue with her.
Yeah.
You don't understand nutrition. Not that I did. I had no
Yeah.
idea. I hadn't the faintest idea of nutrition, but I would argue vehemently that what I was doing was absolutely fine because, of course, there are millions of other people in the world doing it. So it can't be wrong. I had no idea until my health suffered.
Yeah.
So I really want to discuss the bioavailability because you do
Yes.
mention it in your book. And you say, okay, so if you ask dietitians or medical doctors who promote plant-heavy diets,
Yeah.
plant-heavy, they also say that you might need supplementation.
Mm-hmm.
No one ever discusses the bioavailability of those supplements.
No, they don't. And there are two elements of the bioavailability which need to be discussed. One is that anything in artificial form anyway, no matter what the source, is going to be different in your body and it may not be absorbed because it's not interacting in a food matrix with all of the other things, right? Mm. And also the body recognizes it and goes, that's false. I'm not taking that in. So it's the falsity of these artificial vitamins, which can be overlooked, and it's the plant-based source. So if something is a plant-based source of the vitamin, we know that in many cases that is in itself the nutrient is suboptimal. It's, so vitamin A, B carotene does not necessarily translate into vitamin A. So there's all of those issues with vitamin supplements. And actually there was I've been waiting to talk about this actually because it's been infuriating me for a while, that I have suddenly on my Instagram feed, I'm getting all these things from something called Wellco, which is a vitamin supplement company run by Elle Macpherson, the model. And her marketing shtick on this is when she reached the age of 50, she suddenly realized that she wasn't feeling well. She had no energy. Her nails weren't good. Her skin wasn't good. She was tired. And she was a vegan. She's a well-known vegan, mostly vegan, she calls herself. So I thought she was going to say in the next breath, so this is the way I've changed my diet and I now eat animal foods. But no. What she did was she launched discovered a new form of vitamin, which is a funny powder, which has all these vitamins together in it. And she said that has changed her life. And I'm thinking, well, that is obviously just marketing bunkum. But it's again, I wonder if people can see just what a lie it is. Because and she actually says, I was taking so many vitamins, but my body was not absorbing them. Now, why is her body suddenly going to be able to absorb her green powder just because she made it, right? So she's making money, that's fine, but she's also misleading people who will continue to think that artificial vitamin supplementation is equivalent to getting your food in a food matrix, getting your B12 from the places where it really comes from, getting your vitamin A from chicken livers, that kind of thing, or eggs, right? It's a really big issue. And of course, the WHO, if you read the fine print of their reports, The WHO on the surface will talk about plant-based diets being good for people. Then, if you read the detail, you see that, for instance, in countries where there's high grain consumption and very low animal food consumption, they recommend that the RDA, the recommended daily allowance of zinc, for instance, is doubled. The reason is because zinc from wheat products, for instance, is not well absorbed. So you have to eat twice as much. And that is a really acute and stark representation of this bioavailability issue, which is recognized by the WHO. Similarly with iron, similarly with vitamin A. So it's a really big issue, which is skated over most of the time, I've got to say.
And talking of the WHO, of course, it doesn't help that they come up with, they publish studies, which then the media across the world up that meat causes cancer. That wasn't helpful. I mean, that was the one that really infuriated me, because that really is not helpful.
No.
So in one of your podcasts, you're talking about the hazard ratio. I think with with Mark Hyman, actually.
Right.
I was watching the other day, and people weren't aware of the details. They just look at the headline and they decide not eating meat.
Of course. And it sounds very convincing. And you know, I think Georgia Ede does a wonderful job of dissecting that study. And if anybody of your listeners wants to go and look it up at Diagnosis Diet, I think is her website. And I think it's open as well. It's an open website. So you can read it and look up WHO and understand how that study was done and the weaknesses in it. And she basically calls it out as almost fraudulent. And yet the whole world has been led to believe that it is definitive. Yes, red meat is bad for you and may be carcinogenic, says the WHO, and processed meat is definitely carcinogenic. So it's very hard to climb back from that, really hard to climb back. And again, whenever somebody says that to you, whenever somebody says, oh, but that causes cancer, I think it's important for all of us to say, okay, based on what information, which study are you basing that on? They probably won't know, but it's a good thing to make people realize that, the quality of the study may in fact matter.
True. And it's not just the WHO. There's, of course, we have the Eat Well, which Zoe Harcombe calls the Eat Badly plate, and then there's the My Plate and Eat Lancet. They're not helping.
No, they're not helping.
So why are they so biased? Why?
It's a bit chicken and eggy, this question, isn't it? It's hard to know where it starts. What I do know is that those, so Eat Lancet, for instance, the commission was heavily stocked with people with a plant-based leaning, vegetarian or vegan leaning, that they had been publishing about these issues for years. So when you stock a commission with that level of bias, you're going to get a certain result. You add to the fact that the driver of Eat Lancet, you know, one of the key founders was Gunhild Stordalen, again, believes heavily in vegetarianism and might even be vegan by now. And she's picking the people and she's driving the conclusions forward. And who's the chair? Walter Willett. He is a long-standing defender of plant-based eating and a critic of meat. Now, when you stock a commission with that much bias, you're going to get a certain result. You back it up with the money from all of the backers and the associated companies and the governments that are funding that, and you have something incredibly powerful. So they can say whatever they want. But again, what's interesting is the fine print. And I guess if I had one piece of advice for everybody is always read the fine print. And that's true of everything in life, right? But search through, never believe the headline. Because Eat Lancet, although it publicized this diet, which was very low in animal foods and high in grains and that kind of, and plant-based oils, they also admitted in very, clear language that this was not a diet that was suitable for certain people. Now, who is it not suitable for? You probably remember: babies, small children, medium-aged children, teenagers, women of childbearing age, women in the menopause, frail people, sick people, old people. So you're thinking, okay, so it might be okay for someone between 30 and 45. Is that what you're saying? Right? And how they can hold their heads up when they have that level of contradiction within their very own study is something that I can't claim to understand. I cannot claim to understand it at all.
Right. We're going to talk more about the health aspect of a plant-based diet. For me, it was my inability to absorb nutrients fully from plants, combined with the fact that plant proteins are incomplete proteins. I was protein deficient, and I was unable to fully absorb. And I noticed that. In fact, all the vegetables I would grow were organic vegetables grown in my backyard, in my garden. So it would literally be picked 5 minutes before eating. All those salads would come straight from my garden. And yet I realized they're not giving me the nutrients. And it was just a revelation, because I was eating tons of food from my backyard. And yet I had no energy and I couldn't explain it. I realized I needed to eat animal products. So that when it comes to the health side of plant foods, so people would say that, it's healthy because now your risk of heart disease is reduced when you're eating plant-based foods, because animal foods, particularly saturated fat, causes heart disease. Covered it extensively in the book, and I think my audience already knows the story of Ancel Keys and how his hypothesis is now completely debunked. So let's go through that, please, Jayne, if you don't mind.
Well, I won't. If your audience is familiar with Ancel Keys, I won't go back to his day and how it is that he became so preeminent, because maybe that is an old story. But what is interesting is that even since the Ancel Keys hypothesis was debunked repeatedly by many, many studies over the decades, including the Minnesota coronary study, including the women's health study. I mean, you name it. There became this doubt, there arose this real hole in the theory that saturated fat clogged arteries and caused heart disease. Even so, I think it's because the American Heart Association, which is a very powerful entity, has clung to that theory, it's very hard for other organizations to let it go. So again, it's about that knee-jerk reaction that people have, which is, oh, the AHA says it, therefore it must be true. And they've heard it so many times that they just absolutely believe that it's true. But in the past, I would say 5 years, there have been some pretty extensive and comprehensive reviews of all of the information around saturated fat, which have proven on every occasion that there is no cause for limiting those fats and that there is no link between that and heart disease. I am a little bit hopeful that those studies will start to have an impact, that people will begin to see the accumulated weight of all of that and kind of stop and think. And really, the whole saturated fat argument, if you withdraw that as a reason not to eat animal foods, you're not left with very much else, are you? Because that is the main argument that people use when they say, well, you mustn't eat steak because it has saturated fat. In fact, steak doesn't have that much saturated fat, but that's another issue, right? and avocados have more. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, I'm pleased you mentioned the most recent meta-analysis looking at the link between saturated fat and heart disease.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite the opposite seems to be true, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Like that higher red meat consumption seems to lead to fewer all-cause mortality, for example.
Absolutely. And there was a really interesting study of the paleo diet, which was done, I think it was 2020. And they looked at people who followed the paleo diet and how much meat they were eating. And the people who ate the most meat within that diet, so it's a pretty healthy diet, you know, it has a lot of fruits, nuts, vegetables. People who eat the most meat within that had less heart disease than people that ate the least. So again, that was another sort of quite clear indication that we're barking up the wrong tree when we try to hold saturated fat and meat responsible for heart disease.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's just add to that these studies aren't just new. I mean, they were back in the 1960s, 70s, even the Sydney Diet Heart study, and then 66 to 73. They couldn't prove the answer keto theory was correct. These studies were forgotten.
They were.
It is still going on and on.
Well, the Minnesota study was not just forgotten, it was hidden. So it later became, Ramsden and Zamora reanalyzed it when they found the real records in somebody's garage. And they found that it had said the exact opposite of what it was supposed to say. And that result had been hidden because the researchers back in 1960 something, whenever it was done, had been so disappointed that it didn't support the saturated fat diet heart hypothesis. So there's a lot of skullduggery that's gone on, a lot of manipulation of results.
Now, one of the cardiologists, talking of heart disease, one of the cardiologists you reference is, of course, the from the UK, our own Malcolm Kendrick, right?
Oh, yes.
I think he said something like focusing on LDL cholesterol alone as a marker, as a health marker, or cardiovascular health marker is totally absurd. So so maybe we need to focus more on insulin resistance.
I think so. And in fact, he's not the only one to say that, as you know. There are scores of people now, doctors and nutritionists, who are saying this. LDL on its own is not a good marker of heart disease or even mortality risk. So the insulin resistance package, which, of course, Dr. Ben Bickman talks about so eloquently and so clearly, is that group of things: hypertension, triglycerides in the blood, fat around the waist. Those things are much more indicative when combined. And if you have good scores on all of those, but your LDL is slightly raised, you're very likely not at any risk at all. And a lot of people don't know that, and they take statins just as a kind of insurance policy, because statins have been touted as this sort of miracle drug which will insure you, but it's not an insurance policy. A, it's not terribly effective as a drug, but B, if as an insurance policy it stops you doing all the other things that you should be doing to reduce your risk, such as reduce your triglyceride levels, your blood sugar levels, your blood pressure, if it stops you doing that, then it's really not helping you at all, I would argue.
For my audience, if you're really interested in learning more about the now that Jayne brought up the statins, the topic of the statins, please check out Dr. Malhotra's podcast talking about statins, because he does really break it down so beautifully. It's sometimes I just dedicate a whole day on statins and listen to his podcast after podcast, and he just gives all the numbers and he explains so beautifully and breaks it down. And it leaves it to you to decide as a
Mhm.
patient whether you want to take statins or not.
Yeah.
But the focus on insulin resistance is really should be the shift, should be
Yeah.
direction we're going. I've had this
Absolutely.
discussion with Dr. Philip Obedia as well. He's a cardiothoracic
Yes.
surgeon.
He's the one, keep me off your operating table. Is that his one? Yeah.
Stay off my operating table.
Right.
So I've interviewed him. Please, I'll put the
Yeah.
link below so you can listen to him talking about not statins necessarily, but about the lack of importance of focusing on LDL and shifting our focus instead to insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Back to plant foods now.
Mm.
So you eat plant foods.
Yeah.
I eat plant foods. I can't digest them too well, and so I avoid them every other. That's why I only have plant foods every other day and in limited quantities.
Okay.
If I could eat them in larger quantities, I would, because I love vegetables. And
yeah, me too.
Oh, kale isn't good, doesn't taste good. They all taste good to me. I've had them for 30 years. They actually do taste good to me.
Yeah.
But they do give me digestive problems, and so I avoid them for 2 days, and then the third day I have to include some vegetables in my meal.
Yeah.
So we all have to do what works best for us.
Yeah.
But you say very clearly in the book that for most people, eating unlimited of vegetables, which perhaps aren't seasonal, have been flown from around the world, and eating them all year round in unlimited quantities, that seems to be causing problems.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, again, I hate to keep throwing out these names, but there are so many brilliant people working in this field that I feel everybody should know about them. So Sally Morton, that's right, Sally Norton, who wrote Toxic Superfoods and has done years of research on the oxalates in vegetables when taken in excess. And some people are more susceptible than others. And it can cause terrible difficulties, and did for her. You know, she could hardly move her feet. Digestive distress, kidney stones. We've seen actual evidence, and they are not recommended. So vegetables high in oxalates, such as spinach, such as sweet potatoes, are not recommended for people who are at risk of kidney stones or have had one before. And the argument usually comes back, oh, well, if that was really a problem, we would see all kinds of people suffering, and we don't. Well, how do we know they're not suffering from that? People are not connecting the dots. So somebody who feels achy, who has aching joints, pain in the stomach, may not ever even think to tell the doctor about that, or that it may be connected with food. The doctor will not connect the dots and think, oh, let's try you on a low oxalate diet and see what happens. So in my view, and I think in Sally's view, the number of people who possibly are getting excessive oxalates in their diet is probably, a good multiple of what we think. There are people who have discovered it and others who have not discovered it. It just makes absolute sense. And they knew about this in the 1800s, that you could be poisoned by oxalate, right? And we've forgotten it because we've forgotten it because we're enthralled to the vegetable. We think the vegetable can do no wrong, right?
And you do say in the book, in the 1800s, when they knew about possible toxicity of certain vegetables, at least, they'd only have them seasonally.
Exactly. Yeah.
They didn't have access to exotic vegetables all year round.
Certainly not buckets full of spinach in smoothies, right?
Right. And it's not just the oxalates you mentioned. You also mentioned the lectins, and phytic acid or phytates, and some of the other elements. I can't remember what the other one was, but you cover all of them. So you warn people if they have autoimmune issues, perhaps to limit. So at least try limiting their vegetable intake.
And see. Yeah. I think that using meat and animal foods as your elimination diet starting point is a very good way to go, because I really have yet to hear a story of somebody whose inflammation increased by eating a more meat-based diet. I just haven't heard that story. I have heard the opposite story, which is excess vegetables, vegetables only diets can cause this kind of inflammation and distress in some people. So I think it's important for people to experiment and methodically experiment and find out what is really working for them.
You're so right, because for so many decades, and especially with mass media, all we've been told is vegetables are good. Vegetables are good. Vegetables are good. And we're not saying they're bad. We're not saying they're unhealthy. But we've come to a point where we don't put the blame on certain vegetables. We don't put the blame on vegetables. So if we're having digestion, oh, it must be the meat.
Yeah.
I hear that. I work with people. I'm a health coach. I work with people. The first thing they blame is the meat.
Of course they do.
And digest the food, it must be the meat. It doesn't agree with me. It causes me bloating. So it's the meat. It's the cow.
Yeah, it's the cow, blamed at every turn. And so I guess in your work, your job is to just open a little question mark, or at least get somebody to experiment methodically with that to see if it really is, because it's not necessarily, and probably not even likely, that is the case.
Yeah, and people don't join the dots, and that's absolutely correct as well, because if you look at people's ailments, most of the chronic diseases have a common root cause.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One of those root causes, as we were talking about earlier on, is the processed foods. Even the ones that say 1 of your 5 a day.
Yes, exactly.
There's the processed foods, and of course the some vegetables, especially the starchy ones for diabetics or people suffering with insulin resistance.
They're a no-go, right? A no-go.
No, they're a no-go. I mean, fruits, you have to leave them out. Sorry. I mean, even berries. So
but even I know I don't have diabetes. I'm very fortunate in that sense, but occasionally I find myself carrying a few extra pounds and I want to shift them. I know that the best way to do that is to eat mostly meat, vegetables, no fruit yogurts, none of those things that we typically think are wonderful for us. No fruit juice ever, by the way. But if I do that, cutting out the berries, which I love, is a way to lose weight. Now that's perverse for some people. A lot of people think eat only berries to lose weight. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it? That just doesn't turn out to be true.
No, and this is outside your book. I don't think you covered this in the book, but yes, I mean, by calorie restriction, you can lose weight.
Yes.
But is it your visceral abdominal fat that you're losing? Because that's the fat that's dangerous. It's not the fat on. Actually, Robert Lustig said it in one of the. It's not the fat on your bum, ladies. Don't worry about that. When
it's around your liver.
It's the fat in your abdominal area. So, yes, if you're losing overall fat, you might still be retaining your visceral fat. So. That's the fat that we want to lose. And there's no other way to losing your visceral fat other than, of course, restricting your carbohydrates and processing.
Absolutely.
And again, I would do it.
Yeah. I mean, I have a personal experience of somebody who was has been a vegetarian forever, eats a lot of lentils and carbs and things because that's what vegetarian tends to include. She's very thin overall. But she went to her doctor and she was 40% body fat. And we can guess where all that was, because my guess is that those carbohydrates over many, many years, that's what's given her that body fat, even though on the outside, she looks really very slim. So it's a real salutary lesson, I think, when you meet people like that.
Yeah, you call them in your book as TOFI,
TOFI, that's right. Yeah. Thin on the outside, fat on the inside. Yeah.
Inside, that was me. That was especially when I was vegan. And
not
I
anymore.
Borderline. Anymore, I was borderline underweight. So my GP said more, and I couldn't possibly eat more. I was eating every 2 hours, and yet I was underweight, absolutely no muscle mass.
Yeah.
And all of my fat was actually in my central section. So
Well, great for you that you turned it around and that you learned so much and that you thought to try to learn. I think that's a wonderful thing that you explored that. And I read somewhere that you had started doing that in 2015, your nutrition research. Is that correct? Was that around your own health issues? Right.
2015, and I became a vegetarian on my birthday in 2021. So
right.
By then I understood the importance of animal products.
Mm-hmm.
Start introducing them, because it's not easy. I can tell you, it's not easy. When people say it's not easy, it's really not easy. It's not taken seriously enough. That transition is the hardest thing.
I'm sure.
However, it's worth it. So you have to learn to chew meat. Something
I'm sure.
Some people all their life, they've never chewed meat. That's a whole new experience. And it takes a lot of courage to actually,
I bet it does. Yeah. I'm sure
learn how to do that. But I wish I'd done nutrition research to improve my own health much earlier. However, it's never too late. So now, people choosing to eat plant heavy diet, for their own ethical reasons, let's say, or whatever the reasons may be. Now that's one thing. I'll give my example. When I was vegetarian, it was my personal choice. I actually cooked meat at home for my family.
Did you? Okay.
When my child was born, I gave her meat. My child has never been a vegetarian. I always thought if she ever wants to be a vegetarian, that should be her choice when she's old enough.
I think that's great. Yeah.
So fortunately, when I was vegetarian, there wasn't this online influencers and community, so you could be part of a big community. It wasn't trendy. Most certainly was not trendy. No. I was the odd one out. So that's one thing when you're doing it just for yourself, but it's another. If you are a parent and you're raising your children, your babies on a vegetarian or vegan, plant-only diet. That's, in my opinion, irresponsible, because you're not giving complete nutrition to your parents. In fact, you cite 2 or 3 cases around the world where parents have been prosecuted.
Jail, right? Prosecuted and sent to jail because they have caused severe illness or death for their children by feeding them vegan diets. Now, those vegan diets obviously would not have been the so-called complete plant-based whole food diets that many vegans would eat. But in the extreme, it does go to show you that doesn't provide, that these plants do not provide complete nutrition. And if Eat Lancet, this very pro plant-based organization, is saying that their diet is not appropriate for babies and children, then we know it must be true, right? Because they would not want to be saying that. The whole notion of feeding children a vegan diet, I think, is well recognized by the European guidance bodies, much more than the American and the British. And if you look to most of them, the French, the Belgian, the Italian, the Spanish, the Danish, they all say that it's not advisable to feed a child a vegan or a vegetarian diet. So, and I think that's interesting that they stand out so independently, whereas something like the American Dietary Advice Organization says it can be good for everybody, provided they supplement. So you're talking about, giving small children a plate full of vitamin pills every day. And as we've talked about before, they may not even be absorbing those vitamins.
I think this should be our mission, and this certainly was your mission. Your main aim when you wrote your book, to put the information out there and let people decide for themselves. It's rather than just coming to that idea that, plant-based, it must be healthy. It's healthy for everyone around the world. You actually quoted Ivor Cummins, and I love what he says, is that people can eat however they want, But the trouble is that some very powerful interests are driving an ideology that will hurt people. And that makes it my business.
Yes, that's so true. Yeah.
So it's our business actually to present all the arguments and make and let people make a better choice. I think Ken Berry was saying in one of his presentations that when people smoke, they're beholding the pack of cigarettes, and they can actually read the health warning on the cigarette. They're aware of it. They know of it. It's right in front of their eyes. They're making a personal choice. They're choosing to smoke. And that's perfectly fine, he says. We should respect their decision, their personal choice. But they've been told. So when it comes to plant-based diet or plant-only diet, not giving people the information. We're not giving people a health warning. Yeah,
that is a great analogy, actually. And it's so interesting, this, to explore the psychology of why people still smoke, even though they have those terrible crossbones and death warnings on the package. And that's a whole complex set of reasons. And we must remember that addiction is part of that reason. But all the same, we need to be getting to that point of view. Certainly with ultra processed foods, we may begin to see package labeling saying that kind of thing in the future. We may see that if current trends develop. But with plant-based diets themselves, yes, there should be warnings that, there's certain nutrients that are not found or not bioavailable, and therefore you will need to take other action. And really, dietary organizations need to be putting that front and center, as you say, on the package or on their website or somewhere.
And that's why you propose something else, some other labeling instead of the 5 a day. What was it that you proposed in the book? Do you mention something else instead of the 5 a day?
I can't even remember what I proposed in the book about a label.
It's real food, something like Eat Real Food. So.
Eat real food. Yeah.
Real food. That has to be the message. The last topic is actually just going back to the 4 questions that your book says it hopes to cover, right? To answer. Right. So let's just go through those four questions and make sure we've answered them in this podcast. Yes. I know we're running out of time. So the first question is plant-based better for health?
No.
Simple answer is no. And we had a lengthy discussion about that. Is plant-based better for the planet?
No. And I think we covered some of that, but maybe not all of the detail, because it's a very, very complex subject about the planet, isn't it?
And this is why people need to buy the book.
Yes, true enough.
You cover it in detail in the book, actually. So, right, we didn't talk about this enough. Now, who is pushing the plant-based diet advocacy, and why are they doing it?
Well, I think we talked about it maybe at the kickoff when I said that there's such a wide range of groups of people that have different reasons for doing it. So corporations will be pushing it because it gives them a way to introduce new product lines, vegan product lines, right? And there's more processing involved in those product lines, which is more profit. So there's a profit motive to some companies, particularly companies that are already very plant-based. So that would even be your Coca-Colas and your Unilevers and all those familiar names. So they have a big profit motive from people saying, yeah, I eat a lot of plants, even if it's processed. Agricultural companies have a big interest in it because from the point of view of, think about fertilizer manufacturers, chemical companies, all of this narrative feeds into a growing market for their products, right? The one thing we didn't talk about was, so that's corporations. We've got the media, which sometimes promotes it for financial reasons, sometimes because of lazy journalism, and because they go with the zeitgeist. They don't read the studies, they don't dig deep, and there's a motivation to just get the story out there and get the headlines. So a lot of a lot of motivation for media is probably just headlines and numbers and then clicks and revenues.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing we didn't speak about a lot was the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which has always had a significant influence. Again, when I mention that to people, they say, well, what is that church? I've never heard of it. So how can it possibly have an influence? And so I think it's down to the fact that they were very influential in the late 1800s, early 1900s, in the formation of the dietitians' cookbooks and textbooks. They were influential in all of the dietary advice committees in the United States. They have hospitals, they have schools, they have companies that push their product, and they are very anti-animal food. They believe it's a sin to eat meat. And that has been true of their religion since it was founded. So the fact that they are a religion, but a religion with power, explains a lot of that influence. And they continue to have influence today. So, and I know Belinda Fettke is brilliant. She's this Tasmanian researcher who has a website that you might want to send people to. I support Gary, and she continues to do research. And she has found that even today, for instance, the ACLM, which is the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, which has its roots in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, is advising Biden, is advising the mayor of New York, is responsible for policy in New York hospitals. So if people think it's irrelevant, it isn't irrelevant. It's right there at the root of everything.
And although they're more powerful in the US, these dietary guidelines are then copied around the world.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So they are actually relevant to everywhere. I've interviewed Belinda and Dr. Gary Fettke, so I'll put the links below so people can watch and find out more. Of course, the last question is, how should we eat?
And of course, I wanted to simplify that because you could write an entire book on just that, and people do write entire books on just that. So I think if you can eat a real food diet, cook as much as you can of it yourself, avoid seed oils, avoid excess carbohydrate, but figure out for yourself what the level is of the carb that you can tolerate and what is driving your own health condition or not. I think those are pretty good rules. And I guess I should say also that within that whole food, real food diet, try to include some animal source foods because you can't beat them for nutrition.
That's a beautiful message to end this on. So I can't thank you enough for coming on the channel, Jayne Buxton. I really appreciate your time. I enjoyed this discussion, and I could easily talk to you for another hour.
Well, we both
already been an hour and a half.
Yes, thank you very much. I enjoyed it. And hopefully I'll see you next year at the conference.
Absolutely, I will be there. So thank you so much, and bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.